There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their true weight hidden until much later, when you replay them in the quiet theater of your mind. For me, one of those moments happened on a Tuesday. It was just a Tuesday, indistinguishable from all the others, except that the air was thick with unspoken things. Liam was standing in my bathroom, a space so small that the steam from a shower could cling to the walls for an hour. He was using my mirror to fix his hair, a casual act of domesticity that had become surprisingly normal over the past few months. He ran his hands through the dark waves, pushing them back from his forehead, his brow furrowed in concentration. But his eyes weren't on his own reflection. They were on mine. I was leaning against the doorframe, watching him, and in the silvered surface of the glass, our gazes met. He didn't look away. His hands slowed, then stilled in his hair. The room was silent save for the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the frantic, useless beating of my own heart. In the mirror, his eyes held a question I was too terrified to answer, a depth that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. It was a look that bypassed the surface and went straight to the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself, asking for entry. He was just fixing his hair, a simple, mundane act. But in that small, steamy room, with our reflections trapped together in a pane of glass, it felt like he was rearranging the entire architecture of my world. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. Liam and I were a study in quiet contrasts, a friendship forged in the unlikely space between the roar of a soccer stadium and the silent click of a camera shutter. I met him my sophomore year of college. I was a photographer for the university paper, a ghost who haunted the sidelines of other people's victories, capturing their moments of glory from a safe, objective distance. My world was one of f-stops and developing fluid, of finding the perfect composition in the chaos. He was the chaos. Liam was the star forward on the soccer team, a blur of motion and kinetic energy, all effortless grace and explosive power. He lived his life in the bright, unforgiving floodlights of the athletic field, celebrated and seen by everyone. My first assignment was to get a candid portrait of him for a feature on the team's upcoming season. I spent a week trailing him, my lens a shield between us. I watched him laugh with his teammates, the sound easy and unburdened. I watched him move on the field, a physical poetry I could only dream of articulating. He was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, powerful, captivating, and completely unaware of its own effect. For days, I couldn't get the shot. Every picture felt like a poster, a piece of marketing. It was Liam, the athlete, but not Liam, the person. Then, one afternoon, after a grueling practice, I found him sitting alone on the bleachers, long after everyone else had gone. The stadium lights were off, and the sky was the bruised purple of late twilight. He was just staring out at the empty field, his shoulders slumped, the boundless energy he usually radiated now drawn inward, contained. He looked tired. He looked lonely. I lifted my camera, my hands moving on instinct, and took the picture. The shutter's click was unnaturally loud in the silence. He looked up, startled, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't a performance for a crowd. It was just him. He didn't smile, didn't get angry. He just watched me as I lowered the camera. I thought he would tell me to leave, to delete the photo. Instead, he just patted the empty space on the bench beside him. I hesitated, then climbed the bleachers and sat down, leaving a careful, respectful distance between us. We didn't speak for a long time. We just watched the sky darken and the first stars appear. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual bravado. "Is that what you do?" he asked. "You just watch people?" I nodded, unsure what to say. "It must be quiet," he said, more to himself than to me. Being the one who watches, that was the beginning. That was the first brick laid in the foundation of us. Our friendship grew in the quiet spaces. He seemed to crave the stillness I naturally inhabited, a refuge from the noise of his own life. My small, off-campus apartment became his sanctuary. He'd show up after a game, the adrenaline still thrumming under his skin, and we'd put on a movie, something low-stakes and familiar. He wouldn't talk about the game, about the pressure or the expectations. He'd just sink into my lumpy couch, his long legs stretched out, and let the quiet settle over him. I learned the topography of his moods. I learned that the twitch in his jaw meant he was stressed, that the way he rubbed the back of his neck meant he was thinking too hard. I learned that he preferred tea over coffee after 10 at night, and that he hated movies with sad endings, not because they made him sad, but because he felt the world had enough of that already. I, in turn, felt seen in a way I never had before. He'd look at my photographs, not with a polite glance, but with a genuine, searching curiosity. He'd point to a print hanging on my wall, a shot of a rain-slicked street at night, the neon lights bleeding into puddles, and say, "This is what it feels like in my head sometimes. All blurry and too bright." He saw the emotion I was trying to capture, the story behind the image. He saw me, and, of course, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, crashing event. It was a slow, creeping dawn, a gradual realization that the quiet warmth I felt when he was near had deepened into something more profound, something that ached. It was in the way my breath would catch when he'd laugh, a full-throated sound that seemed to fill all the empty corners of my apartment. It was in the way I'd find myself staring at the curve of his throat or the way his hair fell over his forehead. It was a dangerous, secret thing, a fragile image I developed only in the darkroom of my own mind. I knew the boundaries. Liam was straight. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a kind, bubbly girl who was as much a part of the sunlit world he lived in as he was. I liked her genuinely. I saw how she made him happy, and I wanted his happiness more than anything. So I built walls. I constructed an elaborate internal architecture of self-preservation. My feelings for him were kept in a locked room, a place I only visited when I was alone, late at night. To him, I was his friend, his anchor, his quiet place. And for a long time, that was enough. It had to be. To risk that friendship, to confess the truth and watch it shatter the beautiful, simple thing we had, was unthinkable. It would be like taking a photograph of the sun and expecting the film not to burn. The years after college passed in much the same way. We both stayed in the city. He went into software consulting, a job that still required the performance of confidence, the projection of success. I became a freelance photographer, my life still a patchwork of quiet observation. Our friendship remained the one constant, a fixed point in the turning world. His relationship with Sarah continued, a steady, predictable rhythm in the background of his life. And my love for him remained my secret, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my own. I photographed weddings, capturing other people's joy. I did portraits, finding the flicker of vulnerability in a stranger's eyes. I went on a few awkward dates that went nowhere, my heart stubbornly unavailable, forever held in reserve for someone who didn't even know he had it. I was the keeper of his quiet, and he was the keeper of my hope, a hope so deeply buried I could almost pretend it wasn't there. We had our routines, our easy patterns. Tuesday night movies. Friday post-work beers at a quiet pub. The occasional Sunday hike. It was a life built on a carefully maintained platonic intimacy, a delicate balance I was terrified to disturb. I was content, or so I told myself, to be the watcher, the one who stood on the shore and admired the ocean, never daring to imagine what it would be like to be swept away by the tide. Then, the storm came. It arrived not with a bang, but with a phone call late on a Wednesday night. It was Liam, his voice thick and broken in a way I had never heard before. He could barely get the words out. Sarah had ended it. After 5 years, she had sat him down and told him she wasn't in love with him anymore. It was over. He said my name, just my name, Eli, and it sounded like a plea. I told him to stay put, that I was coming over. I found him in his pristine, minimalist apartment, a space that had always felt more like a showroom than a home. He was sitting on his leather sofa, surrounded by perfect, impersonal decor, looking utterly lost. A half-empty bottle of whiskey was on the coffee table. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, he wrapped his arms around me and held on, his body shaking with silent sobs. I held him back, my own heart splintering in my chest, half from the pain of seeing him so broken, and half from the guilty, selfish thrill of having him in my arms, needing me in this way. It was the first crack in the foundation, the first sign that the carefully balanced world we had built was about to shift on its axis. That night marked the beginning of the change. He couldn't stand to be in his own apartment, a place suddenly haunted by the ghost of a shared life. So he started staying at mine. At first, it was just a few hours in the evening. He'd come over, and we'd fall back into our old rhythm of movies and quiet companionship. But the quiet was different now. It was heavier, filled with his grief. I became a student of his sorrow, learning its textures and its tides. Some nights he would talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of confusion and hurt, trying to piece together where it all went wrong. I would just listen, offering no solutions, no empty platitudes, just my presence. Other nights, he would be completely silent, staring at the television screen without seeing it, his mind miles away. On those nights, the silence was a fragile thing, and I felt as if my every breath had to be measured so as not to break it. I made him tea. I made sure he ate. I tried to be the solid ground beneath his feet while his world was caught in a seismic upheaval. He started staying later and later. He'd fall asleep on my couch, his face etched with exhaustion even in slumber. The first time it happened, I remember just watching him for an hour. The harsh lines of his grief had softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. I carefully draped a blanket over him, my fingers brushing against his shoulder. The contact was electric, a jolt that shot up my arm. I pulled back as if burned. This was dangerous territory. I was his friend, his port in a storm, and I couldn't let my own buried feelings corrupt that. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door, but I couldn't sleep. I could feel his presence in the next room, a magnetic pull I had to actively resist. I was acutely aware that the walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart were beginning to feel thin, porous. His pain was seeping through, and with it, a terrifying, resurgent hope. The second time he fell asleep on the couch, he woke up with a start around 3 in the morning. I heard him stir and came out of my room. He was sitting up, his hair a mess, his eyes wide with a disorientation that looked like fear. "I thought I was at home," he whispered, his voice raspy. I thought she was going to be in the other room. The rawness of his admission was a punch to the gut. He looked so utterly alone in the dim light of my living room. He looked at me, his gaze pleading. "Don't go," he said, the words barely audible. Can you just stay out here for a bit?" My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a new line, a new request. Staying felt like a betrayal of my own self-preservation, but leaving felt like an act of cruelty. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I didn't sit on the couch with him. I took the worn armchair across from it, a piece of furniture that suddenly felt like it was a continent away. I watched as he lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. He kept his eyes open, fixed on me, as if to make sure I wouldn't disappear. We stayed like that until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window. Two people tethered together by a shared silence, a shared darkness. This became the beginning of the ritual. It was never spoken of, never planned. Liam would come over. We would exist in our comfortable silence or our halting conversations. And eventually, inevitably, he would drift off to sleep on the couch. But now, he would always ask me to stay. "Just until I'm asleep," he'd mumble, his eyes already heavy-lidded. And I would always agree. I'd sit in the armchair, a silent sentinel, watching over his rest. It was a strange, suspended state of being, caught between friend and something else, a role for which there was no name. I was his guardian, his human nightlight. I studied the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the way his fingers would twitch in a dream. I memorized the scent of his laundry detergent mixed with the faint, warm smell of his skin. This nightly vigil was a form of exquisite torture. Every instinct screamed at me to go to him, to smooth the worry from his brow, to offer a comfort that was more than just presence. But I held myself in check, chained to the armchair by my fear of shattering the fragile trust he had placed in me. The geography of the room began to shift. One night, he was particularly restless, tossing and turning, caught in the grip of a bad dream. He whimpered in his sleep, a small, wounded sound that broke through my carefully constructed defenses. I couldn't bear to stay in the armchair, so far away. I moved to the floor, sitting with my back against the couch, my head just inches from his. I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I told myself it was so I could be there if he woke up in a panic. It was a flimsy excuse, a lie I told myself to justify moving closer to the fire. He settled almost immediately, as if my proximity had been a balm. His breathing deepened, and he fell into a more peaceful sleep. From that night on, the floor became my post. It was a compromise, a way to be closer without crossing the final boundary of the couch itself. I was still the watcher, But now I was a part of the landscape I was observing. Then, one evening, the ritual evolved again. It had been a particularly hard day for him. He'd had to go back to his apartment to pack up the last of Sarah's things, a final, brutal severing. He arrived at my door looking pale and shattered, his eyes vacant. He didn't want to watch a movie. He didn't want to talk. He just went to the couch, curled into a ball on his side, and faced the back cushions. I sat on the floor in my usual spot, the silence in the room a living entity, thick with his pain. After an hour, he spoke, his voice muffled by the upholstery. "Eli," he said. "This is going to sound stupid." I waited. "I hate this couch," he said. "It's so narrow. My back is killing me." It was such a mundane complaint in the face of his monumental grief that it caught me off guard. He shifted, turning over to face me. His eyes were dark pools in the dim light. "My bed is huge," he said. "It's so empty." The unspoken request hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. He wasn't talking about the couch or the bed. He was talking about the loneliness. He was asking me to cross the final frontier. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming. This was the point of no return. Sharing a bed, even platonically, was a level of intimacy that our friendship had never approached. It was a space freighted with meaning, a territory from which there was no easy retreat. I could have said no. I could have made an excuse. I could have protected myself. But looking at his face, at the raw, desperate plea in his eyes, I couldn't. The part of me that loved him, the part that would do anything to ease his suffering, won out over the part that was terrified of getting hurt. "My bed's not huge," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But it's more comfortable than the couch." A wave of relief washed over his features, so profound it was almost painful to watch. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded, and the understanding passed between us. That first night was a study in careful choreography. My bed was only a double, a space that demanded a certain awareness of the other person. We lay on our backs, a rigid, deliberate foot of space between us, two soldiers in a truce, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was different from the living room silence. It was more charged, more intimate. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, so close now, the subtle shift of the mattress as he moved, the heat his body generated, a warmth I could feel even across the chasm we'd created between us. I lay perfectly still, my muscles clenched, terrified that any move I made would be misinterpreted. I felt like a fraud, lying next to the man I loved, pretending it was nothing more than an act of friendly compassion. I was sure he could hear the frantic drumming of my heart, a traitorous rhythm that threatened to give everything away. This, too, became a ritual, but a far more potent and dangerous one. The couch was abandoned. Every night, Liam would come over, and at some point, one of us would wordlessly head to the bedroom, and the other would follow. The initial rigidity slowly began to soften. The chasm between us narrowed from a foot to inches. We started sleeping on our sides, sometimes facing each other, sometimes facing away. One night, I woke up to find his arm thrown across my waist, his face buried in my back. His breathing was slow and even, and he was clinging to me in his sleep like a man lost at sea clings to a piece of driftwood. I lay awake for hours, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and breathtaking joy. I didn't move a muscle, didn't dare to breathe too deeply, for fear of waking him and shattering the spell. I just let myself feel the weight of his arm, the warmth of his body, and I committed the sensation to memory. Sure, it was a fleeting gift I would have to live on for the rest of my life. The unspoken intimacy began to bleed into our waking hours. The lines were blurring everywhere. He started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a change of clothes in my closet. We'd make breakfast together in the morning, moving around my small kitchen in an easy, familiar dance. He stopped talking about Sarah so much. His grief was still there, a shadow in the corner of his eyes, but it no longer consumed him. He started to laugh again, real laughs that reached his eyes. He'd tell me about his day at work, the minor dramas and frustrations, and I'd tell him about a photo shoot. It was domestic. It was comfortable. It was everything I had ever wanted, wrapped in the guise of friendship. And that was the problem. I was living in a beautiful, fragile lie, and I had no idea what was real anymore. Was I just a placeholder, a human security blanket until he was ready to move on? Or was this something else? I was drowning in the ambiguity, my heart swinging violently between hope and despair with every casual touch, every shared glance. And that brings us back to the mirror. He was standing there, in my bathroom, a space that was now as much his as it was mine. He was fixing his hair, but he was looking at me. The question in his eyes was no longer just about comfort, no longer just a plea for me not to leave him alone in the dark. It was something more active, more searching. The weeks of sleeping side by side, of sharing a life in all but name, had built up a pressure in the space between us, a charge in the air. The silence stretched on, no longer comfortable, but humming with a new, terrifying potential. He lowered his hands from his hair and turned away from the mirror to face me directly, closing the small distance between the sink and the doorframe where I stood. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. He didn't touch me. He just looked at me, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to read the answer to his unspoken question in my face. My own reflection was no longer visible. There was only him, filling my entire field of vision, and the deafening sound of my own pulse in my ears. The world had shrunk to the space of my tiny bathroom, to the few inches that separated our bodies. Something was about to break. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and unsteady. "Eli," he said, and my name was a fragile thing. He swallowed, his throat moving. I feel like I haven't been fair to you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by the proximity of him, by the intensity in his eyes. What did he mean? Was he about to apologize for using me, for leaning on me too much? Was he about to say he was better now, that he didn't need me anymore? The thought was a shard of ice in my chest. I braced myself for the impact, for the end of this strange, beautiful, painful chapter. "You've been everything," he continued, struggling with the words. "You let me invade your space. You let me cling to you. And I never asked if you were okay with it. I just took what I needed." He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. "I'm sorry, the apology wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't an ending. It felt like a beginning, an opening." He was seeing me again, not just as a source of comfort, but as a person with my own needs, my own boundaries, boundaries he knew he had crossed. I found my voice, though it came out as a whisper. "It's okay, Liam. I wanted to be there for you, but was it okay?" He pressed, taking another half step closer. We were almost touching now. "Was it okay when I fell asleep on your couch? Was it okay when I asked you to stay? Was it okay when I ended up in your bed, night after night?" Each question was a hammer blow against the walls I had built. He was forcing me to acknowledge the truth of what we had been doing, stripping away the layers of plausible deniability. He was asking for a confession, but I didn't know which one he wanted to hear. "It was okay." I repeated, a useless, hollow phrase. It was so much more than okay. It was the most exquisitely painful and wonderful thing that had ever happened to me. He shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "You're a terrible liar, Eli." He lifted a hand, and my entire body went rigid. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently touching my cheek, his thumb stroking the line of my jaw. His touch was tentative, questioning. It wasn't the accidental brush of a sleeping friend. It was deliberate. It was intentional. It was an admission. And in that one, simple gesture, the entire dynamic of our world tilted. The air crackled. The room felt superheated. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the raw vulnerability of the moment, and leaned into his touch. When I opened my eyes again, his face was inches from mine. His expression was one of profound, heartbreaking sincerity. He looked scared. He looked hopeful. He looked like a man standing on the same cliff's edge as me. "Can I ask you something strange?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I could only nod, my heart lodged somewhere in my throat. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes. The world seemed to slow down, every second stretching into an eternity. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, it all faded away into a dull roar. There was only his face, his touch, his question hanging in the air. "Would it be okay?" he breathed, the words a ghost of a sound. "If I kissed you?" It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a move born of passion or impulse. It was a question of permission. It was an act of profound respect for me, for our friendship, for the fragile thing that was trembling into existence between us. He was giving me an out. He was giving me the choice to retreat to the safety of the world we knew before. But I didn't want safety anymore. I had been watching from the sidelines my whole life, capturing moments instead of living them. And here was a moment, my moment, offering itself to me. I was terrified, but for the first time, my desire to step into the frame was stronger than my fear of burning up. I didn't say a word. I just closed the last remaining inch between us and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was not like anything I had ever imagined. It wasn't a firework display or a crashing wave. It was quiet. It was hesitant. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of his chapstick and the faint, lingering flavor of the tea we'd had an hour earlier. It was the scratch of his evening stubble against my skin. It was the feeling of his hand, still on my cheek, his thumb stroking back and forth in a soothing, grounding rhythm. It was a kiss that spoke of weeks of unspoken tension, of years of buried affection. It was a confession. I felt a tremor run through him. Or maybe it was me. I couldn't tell where one of us ended and the other began. We stood there, in the doorway of my bathroom, for what could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes, locked in this gentle, revelatory embrace. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. We just rested our foreheads together, his other hand coming up to cup the back of my neck. We were both breathing heavily, as if we'd run a marathon. The silence that fell was not empty. It was filled with the magnitude of what had just happened. The unspoken had finally been given a voice, a physical form. The line had been crossed, and the landscape on the other side was terrifying and beautiful and completely unknown. He was the first to speak, his voice a ragged whisper against my skin. "Okay," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement, a confirmation. "Okay," I whispered back, my eyes still closed, trying to burn this moment into my memory with the permanence of a photograph. He kissed me again, and this time it was different. It was firmer, more certain. There was a sense of relief in it, the feeling of a long-held breath finally being released. All the anxiety, all the second-guessing, all the fear that had been my constant companions for months, simply evaporated in the warmth of his mouth, in the solid presence of his hands on my skin. He was real. This was real. He pulled back, his eyes searching mine, and I saw a flicker of something I recognized all too well: fear. The reality of his own actions seemed to be dawning on him. The implications of this irreversible step. The hopeful light in his eyes was replaced by a shadow of panic. He dropped his hands and took a small step back, creating a space between us that felt like a mile-wide canyon. The warmth of a moment ago was instantly replaced by a sudden, chilling cold. I should go," he stammered, not looking at me. He ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture from before in the mirror, but now it was agitated, anxious. "It's late. I have an early meeting." The excuses were flimsy, transparent. The air, which moments ago had been thick with possibility, was now choked with awkwardness and regret. My heart, which had been soaring, plummeted. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss wasn't a beginning. It was a moment of grief-fueled confusion, a mistake he was already scrambling to undo. The hope that had bloomed in my chest withered and died, leaving a familiar, bitter ache. "Liam," I started, but he was already moving past me, grabbing his jacket from the back of a chair. I'll call you," he said over his shoulder, his hand on the doorknob of my apartment. He didn't look back. He just opened the door and disappeared into the hallway, leaving me alone in the silence of my living room, the ghost of his kiss still on my lips. The click of the lock sliding into place sounded like a final, definitive judgment. I had risked everything, and I had lost. The beautiful, fragile thing we had was broken, and I was left standing in the wreckage, the solitary watcher once more. The next few days were a special kind of hell. A silence descended that was unlike any we had ever shared before. It was not companionable or comforting. It was a void. My phone, which had once been a constant source of connection with him, became a monument to his absence. Every notification made my heart leap with a desperate hope, only to crash back down when it was a work email or a spam text. He didn't call. He didn't text. It was as if the kiss had not only broken a boundary, but had erased the entire history of our friendship along with it. I replayed our last moments over and over in my mind, a photographer obsessively examining a flawed negative, searching for the exact point where it all went wrong. His question, my response, the softness of the kiss, followed by the terror in his eyes. I had been so sure, for one breathtaking moment, that we were on the same page, in the same story. Now I felt like a fool. I had mistaken a moment of weakness for a declaration of love. He had been drowning, and I had offered him a lifeline, and in his desperation, he had mistaken it for a permanent shore. Now that he was on solid ground again, he had no more use for me. The thought was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Loneliness, which had been a quiet, manageable roommate for most of my life, became an oppressive, suffocating presence. My apartment, once a sanctuary for him, now felt like a tomb. Every corner held a memory of him. The couch where he used to sleep, the armchair where I used to watch him, the kitchen where we'd stumble through making coffee in the mornings, the bathroom mirror that had reflected our shared, questioning gaze, the bed that still held the faint, lingering scent of him. I couldn't escape him. He was a ghost in every room. I tried to work, to lose myself in the mechanics of my camera, but my focus was gone. I'd look through the lens and see his face. The world seemed to have lost its color, its sharpness. It was all muted, blurry, out of focus. The quiet I had once cherished now felt menacing, amplifying the sound of my own anxious thoughts, a feedback loop of regret and self-recrimination. I had let myself hope, and the universe was punishing me for my audacity. After 4 days of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it had to be better than this suffocating uncertainty. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake. I needed to see the pity in his eyes. I needed the finality of a clean break so that I could begin the long, painful process of trying to heal. My anger, a slow-burning ember beneath the surface of my hurt, began to glow. He didn't have the right to do this. He didn't have the right to kiss me, to open that door, and then run away, leaving me to deal with the aftermath alone. He owed me an explanation. He owed our friendship more than a cowardly disappearance. With a resolve born of desperation, I grabbed my keys, walked out of my apartment, and headed for his. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that the silence had to end, one way or another. I stood outside his apartment door for a full 5 minutes, my hand raised to knock, my courage wavering. What if he wasn't there? What if he was there, but he wouldn't open the door? What if he opened it and looked at me with cold indifference? Every scenario was a fresh wave of nausea. I finally forced myself to knock, 3 sharp raps that sounded like gunshots in the quiet hallway. I heard movement inside, then the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he peered out. He looked awful. He was wearing the same t-shirt he'd had on 3 days ago. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like he hadn't slept at all. When he saw it was me, his expression flickered between relief and sheer panic. He tried to close the door, but I put my hand on it, stopping him. "Liam," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "We need to talk." He avoided my eyes, staring at a point on the wall over my shoulder. "It's not a good time, Eli." "No," I said, pushing the door open a little wider. "We're not doing this. You don't get to kiss me and then just disappear. You don't get to do that to me." My words seemed to break through his wall of avoidance. He let out a long, shuddering breath and stepped back, letting the door swing open. I walked into his apartment. It was a mess. Clothes were thrown over chairs. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table. The pristine showroom was gone, replaced by a space that reflected the chaos of his inner world. He closed the door behind me, but didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice muffled. "I know. I'm a coward." I stood in the middle of his living room, my anger beginning to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of sadness for both of us. "I just need to understand, Liam," I said, my voice softening. "What happened? What was that kiss? Was it just a mistake?" He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The sight of him so undone, so vulnerable, shattered the last of my anger. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "It wasn't a mistake." He took a shaky breath. "That's what scares me." He sank onto his sofa, burying his face in his hands. I sat down in the armchair across from him, the familiar configuration from my own apartment, but now the roles were reversed. He was the one who was broken, and I was the one who was waiting. "I don't know what's happening to me, Eli," he said, his voice strained. "All my life, I've had this path, this idea of who I was supposed to be. College, soccer, a good job, Sarah, it was all laid out. It was simple." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. When she left, the whole path just disappeared. I was completely lost. And the only thing that felt real, the only place that felt safe, was with you. He paused, gathering his thoughts. At first, I told myself it was just friendship. You're my best friend. Of course I'd feel safe with you. But it was more than that. Being near you, it quieted all the noise in my head. Sleeping next to you was the only real rest I've had in months. His confession was a balm on my raw, wounded heart. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. I started to realize, he continued, his voice dropping lower, that I wasn't just missing Sarah. I was missing a connection that maybe was never really there in the first place. With her, it was always the performance. I was the confident boyfriend, the successful guy. I was playing a part. With you, I never had to play a part. I could just be. He looked around his chaotic apartment. This is me, Eli. The real me. Messy and confused and scared. And you're the only person who's ever really seen that. He finally looked me directly in the eye. And the vulnerability, there was absolute. That night, when I kissed you, it was the most honest thing I've done in my entire life. And it terrified me. Because it meant that the path I thought I was on, the person I thought I was, it was all wrong. And I have no idea who I am if I'm not that person. I finally understood. The withdrawal, the silence, it had never been about me, not really. It was about the cataclysmic shift in his own self-perception. Kissing me had confirmed a truth he wasn't ready to face. He wasn't just grieving a relationship. He was grieving an entire identity. I closed the distance between us, moving from the armchair to sit beside him on the sofa. I didn't say anything. I just took his hand, my fingers lacing through his. His hand was cold, but he gripped mine tightly, a lifeline. We sat there in silence for a long time, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of absence or the silence of tension. It was the silence of two people finding their way back to each other in a new and unfamiliar landscape. It was the quiet after the storm. You don't have to have it all figured out, Liam, I said softly. You don't have to know who you are. You just have to not run away. He turned his head and looked at me, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. A small, watery smile touched his lips. I'm done running, he said. And in that moment, I knew that we were going to be okay. The foundation had cracked, the old structure had fallen, but here, in the rubble, we were finally ready to build something new, something real. The days that followed were tentative, like the first green shoots of spring after a long, hard winter. There was no grand, cinematic moment of declaration. Instead, our new reality was built slowly, piece by piece, in small, quiet gestures of intention. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a gentle, unspoken certainty. He started staying at my apartment again, but it was different now. There was no pretext of grief or need for comfort. He was there because he wanted to be with me. We still slept in the same bed, but now, when we reached for each other in the night, it was a conscious choice, an affirmation. Waking up with his arm around me was no longer a secret, stolen joy, but a simple, beautiful fact of my morning. We learned to talk, really talk. He told me about his fears, about the daunting task of reevaluating his whole life. I told him about the years of silent affection, about the secret room in my heart where I had kept my love for him locked away. Laying our truths bare was terrifying, but it was also liberating. We were dismantling the walls between us, brick by painful, honest brick. A new domesticity settled over us, easy and unforced. His things began a slow, steady migration from his apartment to mine. First it was a few books, then a favorite coffee mug, then his entire collection of ridiculously soft hoodies that I had secretly loved to borrow. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, began to feel like our home. We found a rhythm. I would wake up early, drawn by the quiet light of dawn, and he would mumble in his sleep, pulling me back into the warmth of the bed for a few more minutes. We'd make coffee together, our movements synchronized in the small space of the kitchen. I started taking pictures of him again. Not for an assignment, not from a distance, but up close. Candid shots of him reading on the couch, his brow furrowed in concentration. A portrait of him smiling, the morning light catching the gold flecks in his eyes. My camera, which had always been my shield, my way of keeping the world at a safe distance, was now a tool for connection, a way to say, I see you. You are beautiful to me. And he, who had spent so much of his life performing for crowds, was finally, completely, unguardedly himself in front of my lens. One Saturday afternoon, a few weeks into this new beginning, we were at his apartment, packing the last of his things into boxes. The space that had once looked so broken and chaotic now just looked empty, a shell of a life he was leaving behind. He was taping up a box of kitchen supplies when he paused and looked at me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said, "I think I was in love with you for a long time before I knew what it was. I stopped what I was doing, a stack of old paperbacks in my hands." "What do you mean?" He leaned against the kitchen counter, a roll of packing tape in his hand. "I think I was in love with the quiet," he said. "I was in love with the way you saw the world. I was in love with the feeling of being with someone and not having to say a word. I didn't have the language for it. I didn't know that feeling could be this kind of love." His words were a gift, a key that unlocked the past and rearranged it into a new, more beautiful shape. All those years of my one-sided ache, perhaps they weren't so one-sided after all. He had been feeling the pull, too, a gravitational force he couldn't name, drawing him toward my quiet orbit. We finished packing, the two of us working in a comfortable, efficient silence. The last box was sealed. Liam looked around the empty apartment, at the blank walls and the indentations in the carpet where his furniture used to be. I expected him to look sad, to feel a pang of nostalgia for the life he had built here. Instead, he just looked relieved. He turned to me and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Ready to go home?" he asked. The word hung in the air between us, simple and profound. Home. He wasn't talking about his empty apartment or my cluttered, comfortable one. He was talking about something else, a place we were building together that wasn't defined by walls or a mailing address. I smiled back, my heart full to the point of breaking. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go home." That night, after we had unloaded the last of his boxes into our living room, we were both exhausted. We ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor, surrounded by the organized chaos of our merged lives. It felt right. It felt like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, I found him standing in the bathroom, in front of the mirror. It was a perfect echo of the night that had changed everything, a scene replayed with a completely different emotional score. He wasn't anxiously trying to fix his hair. He was just standing there, brushing his teeth, his movements slow and relaxed. I leaned against the doorframe, just as I had before, and watched him. He caught my eye in the mirror, and this time, there was no question in his gaze, no fear, no uncertainty. There was just a deep, calm, and abiding affection. He rinsed, wiped his mouth, and then he turned to face me. He didn't hesitate. He closed the small distance between us, wrapped his arms around my waist, and pulled me into a kiss that was both passionate and profoundly peaceful. It was a kiss that said, "You are my safe harbor. You are my home." We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. The quiet that had once been a space for my secret yearning, and then a void of his painful absence, was now a sanctuary for our shared love. It was a language we both understood perfectly, a space where we could just be, without performance or pretense. In the end, it wasn't the grand declarations or the dramatic moments that defined us. It was the accumulation of small, quiet truths. It was the weight of his head on my shoulder during a movie. It was the shared glance across a crowded room. It was the comfortable silence of two people reading side by side on a rainy Sunday afternoon. It was the simple, profound peace of knowing that, after a lifetime of watching from the outside, I had finally found my place inside the frame. Some homes, I've learned, are not built with wood and nails, but with shared moments and mutual understanding. Their doors unlocked by a quiet, hesitant question, their rooms filled with the light of a love you never realized you were waiting for.